Welcome to week 12. This week we'll go into how to use effects and animations with jQuery. That's something that jQuery is mostly known for. To do these bits of animation or effects would take quite a few lines of code in JavaScript, and that's where jQuery excels. It comes in and takes multiple lines of code and puts them into one function. So our objectives this week are to just simply be able to add effects and animations. We want to know which methods to call on when. We want to describe how to stop and start a slideshow with interval timers, something we've already done in JavaScript. And in general, we want to understand how jQuery works. If we can see through the single word functions into how they might be coded in JavaScript, it'll help us understand why jQuery is useful. We also want to explain how we can chain multiple methods, whether they be effects or animations, and how to get the data back from the callback functions that most of these methods provide. We'll also need to describe the use of the delay and stop methods with effects and animations, how to stop what we're doing. And we'll need to describe the use of easings and effects with effects and animations. So these are the big ones we need to know. I realize these PowerPoints can be a bit bloated, but if you narrow it down to this: the show, hide, toggle, slide down, slide up, slide toggle, which is rarely used but very effective, the fade in, fade out, fade toggle, and fade to. All of these, you can see where they could be confused with one another. But the most prominent are at the top: show, hide, and toggle. And the rest, I use fade in, fade out a lot, but the top are definitely pivotal. So the basic syntax for these, and this is everything but the fade to, is you put your method name, it takes two parentheses, and inside there you'll have the duration of the effect or animation, and then after that you'll have the callback. And all that means is the function closure and whatever data callback data it provides. So the basic syntax for the fade to method, which is a little bit different, is it takes that the second parameter. You've got a duration, how long will it last, and then the opacity for that fade, and that's generally a decimal. So let's move forward here. This is an example of an HTML heading that's animated right after a web page is loaded. So let's say we have a construction page. Here you see an H1 tag with an ID startup message. Well, what we can do is just access that through our jQuery methods and then append the dot fadeout and then its duration of 5 seconds. So with chaining, which is really effective with JavaScript, you can do two things at once. So if we use jQuery and we access that startup message and then have the same fadeout 5,000 milliseconds, we can append slide down. So after the 5 seconds, it will slide down for 1 second. So you'll see that again that fade to is just a little bit different because it has the second parameter. And here we see startup message fade to. We have 5,000 milliseconds and a 1/5 or 0.2 opacity, and then it fades to in 1 second a full opacity. So we're going from transparent, almost completely transparent at 0.2, and then fully visible. That's the fade to method chained. So lastly, let's get an example of the callback function with this. So we've got jQuery with a callback function that gets the same result as the chaining. So again, I have the startup message, and as planned, as we said in the last slide, it'll run for 5 seconds. It'll start at 0.2 opacity, and then we're running a function closure with a callback, so that this, which is the startup message, will fade to 1,000 in 1 second. So there's your callback. It simply is a function closure that runs when this finishes. So we can see this and apply these methods to the same applications we've been using from our text and from the past few weeks. The FAQs application, for example, as the text for a heading that's displayed, we could simply apply it to each one of these header tags and have them fade, expand, hide, whatever we want. If you recall, the HTML for the FAQs application is pretty straightforward. We have a section with the H1 header and 3 H2 tags. So when you see these 3 H2 tags, start to think loop and application of click event listeners. That way we can make it a little more dynamic. And this would be the jQuery with the slideDown and fadeOut methods that we could apply to each of these. So we're basically tackling any H2 tag within an ID called FAQs, which you've seen, and on toggle, which was the event that we showed in the last week. We can throw our function closure, add the class minus, but also this .next slide down 1 second. So remember, that is the next event, the next element sibling. And so that is the text inside. So we can have that slide down over 1 second. And all the code for this week is provided for you so you can test and run these examples. So the second closure is it's chaining. It's a function, remove class minus, and then next event sibling, or I'm sorry, next element sibling, fade out in 1 second. And this would be the toggle class and the slide toggle methods. So the toggle class is minus, of course, because we're doing just add class, remove class, and then moving forward, we're sliding the toggle 1 second. So we've made what could be substantial amounts of code consolidated into this one little closure function. So the terms we need you to know are effect, animation, and callback function. So effects are movements, or I'm sorry, animations are movements, and effects would be something like the fade out. So this is also supplied with the book, a slideshow application with fading out and fading in. We'll go over these, I'll do it in several videos. And this is the HTML for that slideshow, where you have a caption, an image ID slide, and a div ID for multiple slides. So if you look at the nomenclature for these images, it's casting 1, casting 2, catch, release, fish, and lures. We have an alt tag which we can utilize for slide titles. And what's critical for this slideshow is the CSS, where each height of the image is 250, of course, but most specifically, we don't want them hidden. So if we have all image source tags inside the div tag slides that are display none, we start everything loaded into the page, but no one can see them. And we can look at different ways to code this with jQuery. So here we have a document ready. This is going to be very similar to what we looked at when we were looking at the same application in just the past couple of weeks. An array of images and a way to image load, so we had an image cache. So the var image itself is not an array, let me be clear on that. And we're doing that each loop with jQuery. Now, you know these as for loops, while loops inside JavaScript, but jQuery again has this each loop, which is a big part of its syntax. And it mocks the for each loop of JavaScript. So we're saying for each image tag in this collection of images in the slides div, for each one of these, let's create a new image, source it to be whatever the attributed source tag is for each picture, and then the title will be the alt tag. And then we're using the push method for arrays. We're pushing it to the image cache. We went over these array methods in week 3 or 4. It's been a while, but basically we're adding it to the end of the array. Once we have this array of image caches, what we can do is start the slideshow. So in this case, we're using the set interval, which we've also covered in JavaScript this semester, and we're going to fade out at 1 second. So this is the continuation of that. So I'm going to go back. Here's the function closure, opening up at the bottom with caption fade out. And then we're also going to make the div slide fade out. And inside there, on every second, because we have this timer going, the image counter, we're going to continually increment. And if you look at the percent there's that use of the modulus operators from way back in week 1 and 2, where we're saying, okay, whatever the counter is and modulus the length, that's the remainder of whatever the counter is plus 1 divided by the length of the image cache. In this case, the image cache length was 5 because we have 5 members of the array. So as we go through, we try to get that remainder. And that is how we're keeping track of what image we're on. So the next image would be the index of the image cache. And once we do that, we can take the attribute for the source, find that next image source, fade it in, and fade in the caption. I think this is a nice brief way to do it. I think it might be a little bit complicated because of the modulus and the way the words, the way the next image is being loaded. We could also do this strictly numerically. However, I like how the book's author has become as dynamic as possible. Also, the slide attribute here in the caption, those 2 lines where we're talking about finding the attribute as the source tag and then fading it in and fading in the text at the same time is actually quite effective, especially when it's in a set interval. Now, if you go to the second to the last line, this is where it's very vital because it's running in 3 seconds, 3,000 milliseconds. So we've got a set interval for 3,000 seconds on this slideshow, and we're simply controlling each one at a given period, a given interval, and making it faded in 1 second. But what is, I think, most confusing to students and the audience who watches this is the image counter equals image counter plus 1 modulus image cache length, which is simply finding, creating an index for that image cache array to figure out what the next image is. So we can look at other ways to code this same application with jQuery, and in this case, we're pulling in the first child of the image. So we've got initially the first image child. The first image is going to be there. So we've got next slide, next caption, slideshow, and then we start our set interval. I'm going to go to the next slide real quick so you see the interval. And once again, it's 3,000. And as we scroll down, our closure is to fade out the original caption in 3,000 milliseconds, 3 seconds, and then run our closures, which is figuring out, without going through that complicated modulus operator, if the next slide, next element sibling, if the length is 0, then the next slide equals the first child. That just means that there's nothing at the end, the next. Otherwise, next slide equals next slide next. So we're testing to see if there is a next slide, and if there isn't, if the length is 0, then the next slide is that very first slide. Otherwise, simply make the next slide the very next slide or next element sibling of those slides. And then we've got our attribute source, our attribute alt tag, importing them into variables, and then fading both the source image and the caption in 1 second. So we've removed that complexity of that image cache array with the modulus operator from the previous slides. So here's an example of jQuery stopping and starting a slide. We've got the same code as before, and we're running the slideshow as we would normally. We've got the fadeout 1000, fadeout 1000, and then again the same block of code with the examination of the length of the siblings to see if there are any more, and making it first child if there aren't. Otherwise, going to the next slide. And then once again grabbing the source and the caption and then fading them in. But this is where we focus. When we start the slideshow, the var timer set interval run slideshow is 3000. Well, once we toggle that slideshow for the div ID slide, then we can clear the interval, same way we do in JavaScript. And we're clearing timer 1, and if they toggle again, we're setting that interval again. So what's different about this one block is the toggle event applied to the div ID slide. and whether we can, clear it and set it, because that's what's running our slideshow anyway.